Hello and welcome back to Dail Talk, the Irish Mirror's political podcast. I am Louise, Burne, political correspondent, and I am joined by Ferghal Blaney, political editor. Hi, Ferghal.
Hello, folks. How are you all doing?
So it's been kind of an interesting couple of weeks. We had the budget obviously 2 weeks ago, and there's kind of been a bit of a lull ever since. Obviously, there's been big fallout over the budget. While it seems that everyone was getting along, we have heard since that there was a fallout over the health budget. And then to add to the kind of the rows and the anger over the last couple of weeks, there's now a argument over refugee accommodation for Ukrainian people arriving here fleeing the war. Ferghal, I know you were writing about this yesterday. What exactly is this row that's going on in Cabinet today and yesterday?
Yeah. So I suppose, first of all, they're saying that there is no row, which kind of piques your interest as a political hack. You say, oh, geez, there might be something here. So we heard rumblings of this yesterday afternoon, and I was actually at an event with Micheál Martin, and he did his usual furrowed brow, and he goes, oh, there's nothing to see here, nothing to see here. And then it emerged during the afternoon that the Greens had brought an unofficial memo. It was called a presentation. And just to give a bit of background to our listeners, I suppose, the way things work in Cabinet is it has to be structured because there's three parties in it for starters. So a minister brings something called a memo. And that's basically a decent note, and it's handed to everybody else, and people are au fait with it before they go into the meeting so they can prepare. And there was no memo prepared for this issue, which was on the Ukrainian refugee crisis and what we're going to do next, because between Ukrainians and other international protection applicants, CSO said this week we have over 96,000. So that can't continue indefinitely. And it has been raised many times at leaders' meetings, etc., and it's been mentioned at Cabinet. And it crosses a lot of departments, as well as Roderick O'Gorman as the Minister for Education, as well as his department. Obviously, affects housing, affects education, affects social protection, all of them. So to get back to the crux of last night, yesterday afternoon, really, just yesterday morning afternoon, the Cabinet meeting was on, and Roderick O'Gorman presented his latest proposals for discussion. He said, after 90 days, Ukrainian refugees, maybe we should look at sending them into the private market to fend for themselves, so to speak. And this caused a couple of ructions with a few ministers saying, hold on a sec, this housing might say, does that mean I look after them all? Schools are saying, education, well, what if they're in a school? Do they have to leave if they go looking for another? And then there's the basic principle of we don't have any houses in Ireland for the people that are looking for all these homes all of a sudden. So it kind of ended in a little bit of a, I suppose, a sour taste to the Cabinet. So nobody really agreed on anything. There was no formal memo, so there was nothing to vote on. And it all emerged then in the papers this morning, if you're reading in the Mirror and the Star and elsewhere, that there was a row last night and people are not happy with each other. I think it exposes the tensions that are beginning to manifest themselves in this coalition. There's always going to be tensions in a coalition, but this one was kind of cohesive for the last. It was almost disappointing there was no rows for the last couple of years. But now it's getting a little bit closer to crunch time. And I think the seams and the rifts are starting to be exposed. These are three very different parties. They're getting to the end of their term, and they're getting towards the end of their tether as well, because they want to make sure that they're remembered. They want to make sure they have a legacy. They want to make sure that their elements of the programme for government get implemented, because the programme for government is never, ever implemented in full. So you have to fight for yourself, for your own party, to get the best done. And I think we're starting just to see the natural tensions start to spill over. And we're hearing about it here in the corridors in Leinster House. And Louise, I'm sure you're hearing about it even this morning as we speak in the aftermath.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's been a lot of confusion over this over the last couple of days. There was reports in the papers last week that the government were considering limiting the amount of time that a person could spend in a hotel that was fleeing the war in Ukraine, that could spend in a hotel here. And that, I understand, sources telling me today, that was first discussed at a subcommittee. Really, it came up a fortnight ago. It's kind of been in the ether for a little while, but really the first discussion was on it 2 weeks ago. Now, on Monday night, I was on what we call cabinet duty, which is trying to figure out what's going to cabinet the following day. And there was reports over the weekend of this new Roderick O'Gorman plan. And I was trying to figure out, was it going to cabinet the following day? And the Taoiseach the Taoiseach and Eamon Ryan have what's called a leaders meeting. And that's where they discuss all these things to make sure, I guess, there's no surprises. That wasn't agreed on, this proposal on Ukrainian refugee accommodation. It was not agreed on by the three leaders. So the idea there is that it does not come up during cabinet. And I think what a lot of people are annoyed about is the fact it did come up during cabinet, because there's no memo, there's no real concrete proposal. is what's being said a lot today, that this is an idea that's being developed and a proposal that's being looked on. But until it's signed off by the three leaders, it's not signed off. And I think that's why a lot of people are annoyed that it was brought up at the cabinet meeting on Tuesday. Now, I was at a doorstep.
Louise, do you think that, just to stop you there, do you think the three leaders have a bit of responsibility here? You said it's their job at the leaders' meeting to make sure there's no surprises. This was one hell of a surprise for everyone at the meeting when it was presented at the end, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of people saying that should it have been brought up at all. It was brought up under a category which none of us have ever heard of any other business at the cabinet meeting. There isn't any other business action. I've never heard of it, but I don't think.
No, I've never heard of it. You'd hear it at a GAA club's AGM or a golf club's AGM.
Yeah, so it's not the kind of thing. It's not the kind of thing that something like this should be brought up upon. So I think that's the kind of thing. I mean, it went through the right channels. It went to the leaders' meeting. It has been discussed at subcommittee, so it went to the right channels. I guess who brought it up is the real question. Was it Roderick O'Gorman? Was it someone else asking about it? Because from what I understand, it's not signed off. It has to go back now and be looked at again. I was at a doorstep with Junior Integration Minister Joe O'Brien earlier, and he was saying, look, this 90-day thing, the 3 month that's being floated, that it's not as black and white as it seems. It's actually not something that there's a concrete proposal on. It's something that's being discussed. It's something that's being looked at. But nothing is agreed, nothing is signed off upon. It's all just being examined. And I suppose he was kind of saying in the same vein, look, we have had times over the summer where we've nearly run out of accommodation for Ukrainian refugees. Hotels are not necessarily the best place for people who are trying to integrate into a community. And that is hard for them as well if they haven't got a proper base. I suppose you have to look at it the other side of it though. And I said this to Joe O'Brien, where do you expect these people to go? There's people who have lived here and have roots in a community that can't find somewhere to live. It's difficult for them. So how do you expect people who are moving to a brand new country, they might not fully speak the language, they are also traumatized from a war in their home country, and they want to be in their own homes back home. So it's a lot of pressure to put on someone. And he was saying, well, look, we need a more long-term, more medium-term sustainable solution. But whether there's actually sign off on this or agreement, I think it's going to be an interesting one to see over the next couple of weeks. We still don't know when it's going back to cabinet. Ferghal's my understanding of it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, if they're going to try and bring it next week, they want to start doing a hell of a lot of work on it, because there's a lot of threads to pull on this one. Like I was saying, there's housing, there's social protection, there's education, there's health. Everybody needs an input into this. So it has to be interdepartmental, and it has to be led from the top, I think. So I was trying to kind of tease out some this morning. Is it the leader's responsibility to take this? Should they perhaps give a hand to Roderick O'Gorman? He's got a huge department as well. You know, he thought he was getting into this mainly to be the Minister for Children, but he's Minister for Children, integration, and other elements of it as well. Integration has become massive since the war broke out in Ukraine. It was always a welcoming place to come to Ireland. We've always done our bit when it comes to asylum seekers and refugees, and we will continue to do it. But there's never really been a firm footing, I don't think. There's never really been a proper system in place. We had direct provision for the past 10 to 15 years, and we're trying to scrap that now. We've nothing to replace it with. And you have the war in Ukraine. We now have another war in Palestine. We could conceivably have refugees coming from there as well. There's over 2 million people that potentially have been displaced. So this is something that has to be tackled, and I'm worried that this government is going to be very short-termism, because it has a short term left. Not many of us believe it can last basically another year. Technically, it can last till the end of February 2025, but normally you pull the plug before that, because one of the powers you have as Taoiseach is the prerogative to call the election when you want. You know, so that's a powerful thing. You can pick the best time. So I'm just wondering if the leaders should perhaps intervene here, because it's complicated, number one. Number two, it's a huge workload on Roderick O'Gorman. Number three, it's interdepartmental. It's across a load of departments, really. So I think it needs leadership from the top. And I think the three wise men, as we call them sometimes, Eamon Ryan for the Greens, Micheál Martin, obviously, Tánaiste Rita Fianna Fáil, and the Taoiseach Fine Gael's President Leo Varadkar. I think they need to take the bull by the horns in this one. And
yeah, I think it does raise a question whether this should actually come through the Department of Taoiseach rather than coming through Roderick O'Gorman. So I think that'll be interesting to look at. But I mean, at the same time, as someone said to me earlier, we were always going to get to a stage where we had to put other solutions in place for Ukrainian refugees. You can't have a situation where they're living in hotels forever. And I think what's remarkable is we often remark that the government are being reactive rather than proactive. And here's actually a case of they're trying to be proactive rather than reactive, and it's not necessarily going how they might have envisaged it going.
Yeah, I think I suppose just to move on from it's a big issue. We're not moving on from it flippantly at all, but to move on from it slightly, it is. I think it's a tipping point for the government. I think they're starting to get ratty with each other over a few things. One of the big ones that came out after the budget was a budget story about health. So there was a one for everyone in the audience. I have to say the Late Late Show analogy, it's still topical. When they gave money to everyone, a little bit to everybody in the budget. And like I was saying a few weeks ago, there was damn all that the opposition could do. It was fairly bulletproof in that respect. But then in the days and weeks since then, we've seen that health is going into next year with the 1.8 billion, up to 1.8 billion, probably 2 billion, to be honest, at least, of a hole in its budget. Now, this is a department that's notorious for going over budget with the budget it's given. So they're starting this year, 2024, coming with a hole in the budget, and that hole can only get bigger. And that is leading to tensions in Cabinet and across government, specifically between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael here, because the Public Expenditure Minister, he's the man who writes the checks, that's Prudent Pascal O'Donoghue. He has had to deal with Stephen Donnelly, he's kind of like a reforming Minister for Health, I suppose. He wants to leave a legacy. There's many that say he won't be in politics for a long time, including many in his own party in Fianna Fáil, to be quite honest. And he wants as much as every minister wants, as much as he can get from the government, but he wants a well-funded health service and a well-funded budget, and he's already going into next year with the 1.8, 1.6, 2 billion at least of a whole, and that's massive. That's going to have impacts on day-to-day services, but above that, it's created tensions in the government. You've the optics are bad. You've the Fine Gael minister saying no to a Fianna Fáil minister when he comes looking for essential money. Health is one of the most essential departments. It needs the money, and that is beginning to filter out across the party as well, from backbenchers to other ministers and perhaps at leaders' meetings. That's not healthy. I didn't mean that pun, but that's not healthy, because that's going to mean that Fianna Fáil might hold this back and they might go, okay, Fine Gael have won on that one. Maybe we should kind of look to win on the next one. And all of a sudden, that's not a good basis for making decisions. Not at all. That's just point scoring. And that creates rivalry. And that creates divisions in Cabinet. And that's not what you want when you're trying to run a country. So we have seen it in health. We have now seen it in the refugees accommodation crisis. And do not be surprised at all. The seeds have been sown here now between Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens. Don't forget that Roderick O'Gorman is a Green minister, and there's divisions and there's cracks appearing in what was a fairly smooth and even government, I think, for the first few years, and now I think it's beginning to get a little bit touchy. I think you might agree so much, Louise, or disagree.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we've certainly had moments over the last couple of years where you could feel yourself going, is this the end now? Is this what we fall down over? We had, remember, the whole turf ban row. That was huge. If anything was going to bring down the government, it was probably that. And it was kind of little flashes in the pan, but now it just seems like we're building and building and building. The closer we get to an election, the more agitated people are getting with each other. So you have the health row, the Ukraine row, but also another thing that there could be potentially a row brewing. Don't forget, Helen McEntee, the Justice Minister, has come in for sustained pressure from Fianna Fáil over the last little while. Her handling of a number of crises, especially I think crime in Dublin, has been highly criticised by Fianna Fáil. Last week there was a debate on the death of Shane O'Farrell, who was a young guy who was killed in a hit and run a couple of years ago, and back in 2018 Fianna Fáil had put down a motion saying that there should be a public inquiry into his death. Helen McEntee stood up in the door last week saying no, we're not doing that. I understand that Fianna Fáilers were absolutely furious about that, said that they were going to re-put down this motion and a call again for a public inquiry. And I said to one of them, well, what happens if the government doesn't support your motion, if it tries to oppose your motion? What happens then? Do you get in trouble for voting against the government? And they were kind of saying, well, look, so be it. So there is kind of this sense, the closer you get to an election, I've been saying for about a year, I think it's going to be this time next year. I don't think it's going to last till March 2025. I just can't see it happening. But I think the closer you get to elections, the more parties want to distinguish themselves, and henceforth, the more aggro really they're going to get with each other. So I think it's from here on out, it's going to be bumpy road for the coalition.
Yeah, well, the way things are going, it might be March 2024 rather than March 2025 if these guys just don't get along. But anyway, we'll move along now because we have a lot to talk about this week. And above politics, I say that kind of as a question rather than a statement, is Michael D. Higgins. And he is back in the news again. When Michael D. was a TD and a minister, he was very outspoken. Now he's become president. And the tradition and the custom when you become president is that you are above politics. But Michael D. was never really going to be that sort of president. And he has spoken out in the past, most famously last year. He spoke out against the government, basically, even though he's meant to be there to facilitate the government, some would say. And Articles 13 and 14 of the Constitution say that he has to ask permission for the government to make national statements, etc., etc. But last year, I think it was the middle of summer, it's probably just after the Dáil went into recess, I think in June, he said that housing has been a great, great failure. And if that's not a criticism of the government, let alone a comment on politics, I don't know what is. Then this week, he has always had a strong interest in the Middle East. When he was a minister and a TD, he travelled to the West Bank and to the Gaza Strip many, many times. So on Monday, he was down in Rome. He was at the World Food Forum, and on the fringes of it, he was asked a question. What do you think of Ursula von der Leyen's statements? Now, Ursula von der Leyen is the president of the EU, basically, you know. She is the top official in the EU, and she had said, kind of one-sided really, that it was a terrible atrocity that happened in Israel. It was 1,400 people killed in what has been considered their 9/11. But since then, there's been 5,000 Palestinians killed, and there was up to 2,500 killed at that stage, which was Monday last week. And she didn't mention them at all. And he criticised her for the remarks, and she said she was not speaking for Ireland. Now, this got him in hot water at home because people say, well, he's not supposed to speak for Ireland. He's supposed to be above politics. And then on Wednesday morning, the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, came out to say that it's up to the government to articulate the position on foreign policy. We go back to Rome then again on Friday, and I was down there and I asked Michael D., what do you think of them comments? You know, you're going to step back, and he declared rather defiantly and firmly that he would not be a puppet president and he would not be silenced by anyone. He added that he didn't think the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach were trying to silence him, but in his lengthy 5-minute response to us, he made it clear that he gets letters from people all the time. People ask him about immigration, people ask him about climate change, and he says that when he is asked questions like we were asking him on the fringes of the World Food Forum, he's going to answer them honestly. So that comes to the core and the nub of the question. Do we think that he has overstepped his mark? And I'll be quite honest here. I don't think so. I think he's perfectly entitled to speak his mind. I might be in the minority out there. I've read a lot of columns during the week where they say he should stay out of it. Michael D., it's nothing to do with you. Do what you're supposed to do. But he said last week he's not going to just sit there and read bits of paper and sign them. He's referring there to his constitutional duty to sign bills when presented by the government. He can do very little when he's presented with a bill. Ironically, he can refer them to the Supreme Court, which he did just 2 weeks ago on the judicial bill. But he's saying that he's a president, he's a leader, and he's going to speak out when he wants to. I think he should. All he did last week was answer a question. He didn't make a national statement. He didn't outline a new policy. He spoke for both sides. He said, obviously terrible atrocities in Gaza, terrible atrocities in Israel, and he gave his opinion. And I don't think there's a whole lot wrong with that. And I don't think people, when they voted for Michael D., expected him to go off softly into the night and to stay in the Oras for 7 years, 14 now, because he won a second term. I think they knew exactly who they were voting for, Michael D. Higgins. He's a strong, opinionated man. He didn't step outside the breaches of his office last week, and I think he's going to do it again, which will be fun too. Louise, what's your take on Michael D.? Is he overstepping the mark for a presidential man?
I mean, technically and constitutionally, he is. He is meant to be above politics. Now, he is known as someone who's always had strong opinions, and that's fine. But I've been speaking to people in government who they're not impressed. And as someone said to me last week, he was giving out about Ursula von der Leyen overstepping the mark and making comments that don't necessarily represent everyone. And someone was saying to me, well, could you not have applied the same to him in a lot of what he has said over the last couple of months? Now, that's not saying he's right or wrong. And in some of his contributions, he has been dead on the money. But I think the government won't criticise him. They are loath to say anything negative about him on the record. I think privately, they're not impressed. But I think there's also an acceptance that now he's coming towards the end of his term. he has a lot to get off his chest, and there's probably going to be many more interventions like this. But I mean, if you're talking constitutionally, has he overstepped the mark? Yeah, he has. If we're talking he has.
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I was on a plane coming home last week, and sad as I am, I read Article 13 and Article 14. It's not easy to read, and I did law myself in the past. And it's very arcane language. Remember, the Constitution was written in 1937. It came in 1938. My God, we barely had motor cars back then. You know, the world is a very, very different place. Politics is a very, very different place. It's far more diverse. We have coalitions is the norm. We don't really have kings and queens around the world anymore. So we've gone away from monarchy-led governments and direct rule, things like that. And we've got healthy, vibrant democracies where everyone's allowed to speak their mind. And why should the president be allowed to speak his mind? You know, he's an intelligent man. He's well-read. He's got 50 or 60 years of experience. I remember a line, actually, he said in the last presidential debate, he was criticized for not turning up at some of the debates. And why wouldn't he? He was winning by a country mile. All he could do was lose it by going to debates. But he gave a great line when he said, why didn't you turn up for the last debates? And he said, well, I've been turning up since 1969. That won that particular TV3 debate. But I think you could apply that line here himself again. He's been turning up and he's been speaking since 1969. He's an expert on this. He has a valuable contribution to make, even as a citizen. And the fact that he's our first citizen, I praise him in this. And I'm being slightly, shall we say, it is in our advantage as journalists that he does speak up. I'll admit that. Like, there was a reason there was a few of us down in Rome there this week. We had a feeling that Michael D, he was the keynote speaker as well at the World Food Forum. You could have someone like Boutros Boutros-Ghali or Mary Robinson or any of them, the elders of the UN. It was basically the UN's food conference. Any of them could have been the keynote speaker. He was there. He knew he had an international forum and he knew to be a national forum. And the issue at hand, Gaza and the Middle East and Israel, it's just one that's too close to his heart. If he was asked the question, which he was never going to refuse to answer it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So according to the Constitution, he needs to ask permission for the government to do national statements and to address the Dáil, etc. He's just answering questions, and I'd say let him off. It's great for him. It's great for the people. It's not bad for news too, I suppose. Safe to say.
Well, if that's the case, you maybe stick to the Dáil. Like, it's not that he didn't know what was in the Constitution when he went into office. And again, I'm not saying he's been right or he's been wrong. There's been points he's made in his presidency that I have agreed with. But I mean, technically speaking, if you're being technical, he's overstepping the mark, but I won't fall out with Ferghal over it. A couple of other things happening this week. I know you were at the Global Ireland Summit with Micheál Martin earlier this week, and I guess kind of a hot topic of conversation at all times really is the Gardaí's interaction with the police in Dubai regarding the Kinahan organised crime group. What did Micheál Martin have to say about that the other day?
Yeah, we've been following this in the Mirror and the Star for years, basically since Simon Coveney was working behind the scenes when he was Minister for Foreign Affairs with the Dubai officials. And part of that process led to this, it was like the wanted posters, the famous wanted posters when the FBI got involved. And the Kinahan now are marked men around the world. There's not many places they can run to. It's believed they're in Dubai, possibly Iran, but the Dubai police were in Dublin this week. I think they might still be here as we speak, actually. And they were talking with the Gardaí. And while that's going on, in the background, you have Department of Justice figures and you have Department of Foreign Affairs figures who are preparing the ground that if these guys need to be extradited, bring them back home, as they say, to face justice here, that's going to be facilitated. And Micheál Martin agreed with that yesterday when he was asked. He said, yes, we're working behind the scenes. He doesn't want to give details away. You don't want to tell these guys when you're going to knock on the door and say, lads, come on, we've got a plane waiting for you to come back home. So I think it's good news. It's good news for Irish crime prevention. And it's good that we're on the international stage. Also, I believe that they were talking about the latest cocaine record haul, 155 million euros worth from the MV Matthew, that cargo ship a couple of weeks ago. Kinahan's believed to be involved in that as well.
So I guess the big other story of this week was those terrible floods in Cork. I know they happened when you were in Rome, and I know President Higgins had comments about them. But I guess really the reaction here, I think it's been unprecedented, really. Both the level of the flooding and I think the support and how quickly the support is going to come through. Like I said, I was on cabinet duty earlier this week, and Enterprise Minister Simon Coveney brought a plan to government that will give businesses up to €100,000 that have been damaged by Storm Babette. And I think that'll come with really, really good news to those people, specifically in Middleton, who have been devastated by this over the last couple of weeks. But I guess it does raise the wider conversation about flood defences and what can be done as a preventative measure rather than a reactive measure. What was President Higgins saying about that in Rome?
He's saying the government, this time he was commenting on the government again directly. He said they haven't done enough. And he was talking about the precautions that are in place, because he said he visited last time. It was 3 or 4 years ago when it flooded again. It's going to happen more and more often. Climate change is here to stay, no matter what the deniers say, folks. And he said that more should have been done to prepare for this. So he's asking, obviously, in future that there are precautions, like they're saying, rather than being reactive. Why don't we be proactive? As it is now, it's a local issue, but it's dominated the national headlines. Like you said, I was away last week, but this is what we were asking him at an international conference about. It was linked to climate change, which was linked to the food form and food poverty, but it was a national issue that had followed him as such all the way to Rome. I did not realize it was that big either until I came home and I saw the papers were dominated all weekend with it again. And the local TDs, fair play to them, doing their job. They're getting national attention. And James O'Connor, Fianna Fáil, for instance, Dan Boyle, who's a local Green rep, David Stanton for Fine Gael. They were all on news bulletins, they're on panel shows. And there's a bit of a tail wagging the dog element to this, I feel. It's their local TDs, and they were creating the national news. And the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach and the Green leader had to follow, and they had to go down. They had to show leadership. But back to my politics is local, all politics is local point, the famous Tip O'Neill line. This is a very local issue, and it became a national issue all of a sudden, and it dominated the headlines. It could cost, we're hearing the estimate of 100 million for the repairs and for compensation, and people's lives have been ruined, businesses have been ruined, homes have been ruined, and they deserve to be looked after, because a lot of these, the ones I feel really sorry for, have been flooded before and they have no insurance. So basically you've seen pictures of furniture floating in the streets and houses ruined, businesses ruined, and cafes will never open again. And it's just sad day. But it just goes to show that all politics is local, and this local issue has become a national issue, and it had to be dealt with reactively, because the government never acted proactively in the first place.
Well, I guess don't forget as well that Micheál Martin is from Cork. Minister Michael McGrath from Cork, he's the finance minister. So it's a local issue, but it's national, but it's local when it comes back to when you're Taoiseach and you're finance minister.
They're all TDs. They all have to answer their people. They all have to answer to their people first and foremost. There's no one in Dublin going to vote you in if you're a Cork TD. So I understand them doing that.
Yeah. So I think there's been a good reaction. Simon Coveney, actually, the man who brought the scheme to government, he's also from Cork. So Cork with a disproportionate number of ministers, some might say.
Sure, it's the real capital. They're always telling us it's the real capital, but let them off, let them think it.
Well, until Leinster House moves there, I fail to believe it. And that is it for this week. Another busy week for us, and another busy week next week, it has to be said. But we will talk to you when we talk to you. See you, Ferghal.
See you, Louise, and see you, everybody else. Goodbye.